So what they gave us was Alabama at 11, Miami at 12, Ole Miss at 13, and South Carolina at 14. So that's what we need to evaluate. Did the committee get it right on the bubble? That's what we've got to think about, we've got to talk about, and we've got to actually figure out. So here's what I want to do. Since they put Alabama inside this playoff, and they are the best bubble team, okay, and everybody else on the outside, I want to take Alabama team by team and directly compare them and see if they got it wrong. Let's see if there is a crack in the armor of what the College Football Playoff Committee actually gave us as it relates to Alabama. Okay, everyone's wondering. And before I start on this, I just want to say that this doesn't feel like previous years remember when we've had the years like the first year of the playoff, TCU was left on the outside. Georgia last year was left on the outside. There have been teams in the 4-team playoff that get left out. Florida State last year. And you're just like, that is a kick in the gut because that's a team that could potentially win the national championship. And it's just like you feel a great deal of sympathy for that team, their players, their coaches, and their fan base. I don't feel that way this year on the bubble. There might come a year in the 12-team playoff. I don't believe that's going to be the case because all of these teams had ample opportunity to play themselves inside of this tournament, inside of this playoff, and not put themselves on the bubble. Remember, they put themselves here with multiple losses, not just a singular loss in a tough environment, in a tough game, in a tough matchup, but multiple losses. So my sympathy level for these teams is much lower than it's been in previous years when we've seen really good teams that maybe lost one game, or in Florida State's case, no games and lost their quarterback, and then they're left out of the playoff. So I wanted to start with that before we get into this, but now let's actually compare these resumes. Did the committee get it right with Alabama over all these other bubble teams? Let's start with South Carolina. Did Alabama over South Carolina make sense, and did the committee get it right? Well, let's evaluate it. This is what I immediately go to is they beat them head-to-head. This committee has constantly honored head-to-head, and rightly so. I'm a proponent of that. I really am. And so if you have similar records and one team beat the other, you should be ranked ahead of the other. Now, it can stop there or it can continue because I actually think that there are other things that lean towards Alabama. I think the best win Alabama has over Georgia is better than the best win South Carolina has. I think that you look at the number of wins over ranked teams that lies with Alabama. Their strength of schedule is absolutely comparable, so it's very equal. And then you can also go to a common opponent win just a common opponent that each of these two had. One won the game and in emphatic fashion, dominant fashion, Alabama beating LSU at LSU. Meanwhile, what did South Carolina do? They lost that game. That's, to me, something that's got to be looked at. All of those categories, I think, lean towards Alabama. I think they absolutely got it right, putting Alabama over South Carolina. And that's actually the easiest one. I think it gets harder with the other two, with Ole Miss and with Miami. But let's move to Ole Miss now. So bubble teams, let's compare them, Alabama, and now Ole Miss. And this one is much more difficult. When you look up and you're comparing these two teams, Bama does have a better strength of schedule, and I think you start right there. Now, they both have that quality win over Georgia. You could make an argument Ole Miss was better against Georgia than even Alabama was, but, they both have that great win. Ole Miss has, I think, a much worse loss in Kentucky, and more on that later. Alabama has more wins over the top 25 than Ole Miss. You also go back to that common opponent, which I just did with South Carolina, and that common opponent is, again, LSU. And now this time, both of those games were in Death Valley. Now, I get it. Ole Miss led for the entirety of the game, but they lost the game against the Tigers. Meanwhile, Bama rolls in there and beat them handily. And then you get to this idea of, like, who has the worst loss? I think Kentucky is the worst loss, even though you can say, yeah, Vandy and Oklahoma are not great losses for Alabama. We understand that. Kentucky and Florida are not great losses for Ole Miss, and we understand that. But do we really understand the level to which Kentucky's win over Ole Miss was in a lot of ways unprecedented this year. I don't think people realize this. Kentucky won one game against Power 4 opponents this year. One. That game happened to be at Ole Miss. See, that's where all of a sudden the separation occurs. You get separation in common opponent. You get separation in the depth of their worst loss, because everything else is quite similar, and even Bama is better with the strength of schedule. So you've got the same record. You've got the same best win. You've got more quality wins for Alabama. And then you go to the losses and you're like, I'm sorry, Kentucky won how many games against the SEC? One. Won how many games against Power 4 opponents? One. And that game was at Ole Miss. So that game is essentially knocking Ole Miss out of the playoff. I think you could also point towards, that game against LSU, in which they had the lead the entire time. There was a penalty on a late hit against Nussmeier on a pick that would have put basically the game away. Like, any of these little things could happen and put Ole Miss firmly in the playoff. But again, that's why my sympathy is very low, because you had ample opportunities. You had 3 losses. You lost to a team that won one football game against Power 4 opponents. That was Kentucky. So, that loss to Kentucky is ultimately, that's too much. And that's why the committee did get it right with Alabama over Ole Miss. I firmly believe that. Now we go to Miami, and this one is a little bit, I think, more difficult, because Miami's record is better than South Carolina and Ole Miss. So now you've got the 10-2 team, but it's in the ACC. I think it's in Bama's benefit that the ACC is still playing the 8 conference game schedule, just like the SEC is. So now you don't have this idea or thought or theory that the league schedule, while the league isn't as good as the SEC, but it's as difficult or comparable because they play more league games. And let's face it, I think that the ACC was really down this year. When you look at like the middle of the ACC and the bottom of the ACC more specifically, it's not very good. And Miami had the benefit of playing one of the weaker schedules in the conference. In fact, all the teams that finished up top, when you're talking about SMU, Miami, and Clemson, they all had ridiculously favorable schedules as it related to their conference schedule with only 8 games. So now you've got this resume up, and it's like, okay, I get it. Miami is a 10-2 team. Alabama is a 9-3 team. But when you look at the strength of schedule, that starts to even itself out. Miami's strength of schedule is 55. Alabama's is 17. Miami does not have a win against a currently ranked team. Not one. In fact, they're 0-1 against the top 25. Alabama is 3-1 against the top 25. So then you go to the best wins, and you're like, okay, what are the best wins? I think that the best wins for Miami are basically Louisville and Duke. Meanwhile, Alabama has beaten Georgia and South Carolina. That's not even close. That is not even close. I think it makes up for the game. I think it makes up for the game, meaning like the extra loss. In my estimation, you look at the worst loss. Now, that's more comparable. You've got probably Vandy for Alabama. The Oklahoma game wasn't great. Syracuse wasn't great this last weekend for Miami. And then you've got the recency bias, which is Miami has lost 2 of their last 3 games, Georgia Tech and Syracuse. And both of those teams were playing fairly well. So it's like, did Miami beat anybody this year that you could say was playing well at the time? I don't think that they were. Even when I look at this win against Florida, I think in hindsight, it looks better because Florida was able to beat Ole Miss. But this is a different Florida team that we're talking about at the beginning of the year. This is the Fire Billy Napier Florida team, not the DJ Lagway Florida team that was playing so much better. So even that plays into it as well. I think it is a tougher argument. I think it's tough to say this. Games still have to matter. But the strength of schedule for Alabama and all those other factors, ranked wins, best win, recency, and the way that they're playing now with losing 2 of their last 3 games, speaking of the Hurricanes, I think that they got it right. I think the timing of those losses was correct. And I don't say this a lot, which is why it's like, it's a little bit hard for me, but I think that the committee got it right on the bubble. I really do. If I'm looking at those 4 teams and I'm ranking them, I think I put Alabama above all of those teams. I think that the more difficult one, because of the recency of the way they've played in the last month, is South Carolina. Because Ole Miss has not played well lately, and Bama hasn't played all that well lately. And then you get into like, yeah, but Alabama beat South Carolina, and that game has to matter. It has to matter. That's the one that's like, as much as you would want to say South Carolina might be playing better than all of those teams right now, and you might be right, you cannot put South Carolina over Alabama because of the head-to-head matchup. You can't do it. You can't do it. And I do think Bama wins the argument against Miami. That strength of schedule difference is a real thing. The best win difference is a huge deal. Beating Georgia and hanging on for that win is an obvious huge feather in the cap for the Alabama Crimson Tide. And at this point, like, I look at the bubble and I think that the committee ranked these teams properly. I think that this was the right ranking. Putting Alabama inside of the playoff at this point was the correct way to go. And now it will be asked, are they in for sure? Are they in for sure? Well, the playoff is basically set, all right? And I told you this last week as well. There's 8 teams that are definitely in the playoff. And then you've got these 3 teams, games that are basically play-in games. So now we're going to have the Big 12 championship game. Winner of Iowa State, Arizona State, going to the playoff. You're going to have the Mountain West championship game. UNLV, Boise State, winner of that game, going to the playoff. Then you have the ACC championship game. Clemson, SMU, winner of that game, going to the playoff. Thank you for watching the Joel Klatt Show YouTube channel. And if you liked this clip, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, and you can stay up to date on all of my college football coverage.